Once considered niche, the comic book market has morphed into a multi-billion-dollar global industry. The humble comics of our childhood now fuel Hollywood blockbusters, streaming wars, and pop culture trends. But is the industry at a tipping point with print sales down, creators fighting for rights, and publishers consolidating? I'm Divya Gopalan, and you're watching Connected. To discuss the state of the comics industry and where it is heading, we're joined from the U.S. city of Eugene by Ben Saunders. He's a professor and director of Comics and Cartoon Studies program at the University of Oregon. He's also the co-founder of the world's first ever undergraduate minor in comic studies, and is a series editor for the Penguin Classics Marvel collection. A lot of strings to your bow there, Ben. Great to have you on the program. You introduced your university's Comics and Cartoon Studies program. Can you tell us the thoughts behind its inception?
Sure. So comics classes have been offered at the university level in the United States as a kind of cool elective for several decades. The problem was that if the professor retired or lost interest, then the classes would always go away. And I was looking for a way for this beautiful medium that I think is actually one of the most interesting and poorly understood forms of narrative storytelling, and one of the most effective forms of communication, actually, that human beings have ever devised. The study of it was undernourished, and it would always just go away. So by establishing the minor, which involves multiple classes taught by multiple faculty, we could create a kind of institutional presence that would outlast any one individual teacher or teacher's interests. That was part of my thinking, and I've been incredibly fortunate in that comic studies at the University of Oregon is definitely not entirely dependent upon me. I have many colleagues who specialize in, for example, manga, and were experts in Japanese culture, who can teach those classes. My colleague Fabienne Moore, who teaches a class on bande dessinée and the Franco-Belgian tradition. So again, I don't have to try to sort of pretend to be an expert in those fields. Or my colleague Matt Johnson, who is a New York Times bestselling novelist and graphic novelist. He teaches a class for us called Writing for Comics, which is creatively focused. And my colleague Kate Kelp-Stebbins, who teaches classes on graphic journalism and memoir. This means that a field and an industry and a form of artistic production which is every bit as capacious as the novel or the film industry or poetry doesn't fall upon the shoulders of just one faculty member to try and teach it. We're able to draw on this range of experts. And I think that's one of the things that has made our program successful and distinctive.
Right. I'm glad you brought in all the different variations and the range, because there's so much debate on what a comic is. Is a graphic novel a comic? What is manga? Where does Manhwa fit in? So what is your definition of a comic?
Surprisingly, I'm not asked that question very often. I think the answer that I would give is that the definition depends upon what you are trying to get your audience to understand about what you're doing. I mean, you could argue that there are techniques associated with that we associate with comic style storytelling and early animation that you can see on the walls of cave paintings. So you could argue that comics really predate written language by about 30,000 years. Or you could jump forward to something like the 11th century and be looking at the way stained glass windows or medieval manuscripts use sequential narrative techniques. or you could jump forward to the 15th and 16th century in the earliest days of graphic satire in Europe, where you can see things that look very much like contemporary comics being produced in the form of broadsides in places like Germany and the United Kingdom. Or you could jump to the United States in the late 19th century, where comics emerge in something like their modern form in the newspapers in the 1890s. And depending on where you put the origin point for comics, you will end up telling quite a different story about what the medium is, how it works, the impact that it has had. So generally speaking, I think of comics in their modern form as being a more or less American invention of the 1890s that then spreads around the world. But I think there are a number of really important precursors that go back to the medieval tradition.
So going to another, I guess, another one of your projects or responsibilities, you're currently the series editor for the collaboration between Penguin Classics and Marvel Comics. What does that combination look like, and how does that contribute to the comic industry?
Sure. My collaboration with Penguin and Marvel has probably attracted more interest and attention than anything else that I have done. And I think it was because people were still somewhat surprised by a distinguished, storied publisher of what we still might call canonical literature doing something with the comics form. And these Marvel comics are the first comics that Penguin Classics has ever published. So this leads to a lot, an interesting question about what counts as a classic and why something might get counted as a classic. And I would not argue that Marvel's 1960s comics, which are most of the material that appear in that series, are classics in the sense that we think of as traditional literary classics. They're pop cultural classics and classics of their kind. And I think they'd be better compared. You can understand their importance and why a word like classic might be suitably applied to them if you think about other forms of pop cultural production in the 1960s, such as, say, the music industry. In a very similar way to the records at Motown or the early Beatles recordings, these Marvel comics were produced at breakneck speed under factory conditions by people who did not always regard themselves as creating art, and who were seen as essentially producing stuff for kids. The pop music of the early 60s and the Marvel comics of the early 60s, they're all at the time seen as essentially disposable children's entertainment. But I don't think anyone would now dispute that the great Motown recordings of the early 60s or the recordings of the Beatles are anything other than classics. What they are, enormously influential and still incredibly compelling and powerful as examples of their kind. And I think exactly the same thing can be said about the work that Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and Stan Lee and others of their collaborators were doing at Marvel in those early days. They were producing material that has inspired since then literally thousands of pages of follow-up stories, and that it is the template for some of the most successful transmedia cultural production of the 21st century. The success of the Marvel movies and the related merchandise and video games, animated cartoons, television shows, all of which spin out of that extended franchise. It all begins with the work of a pencil and a piece of paper. And it starts with these comics. So I tried to select for that series what seemed to me to be kind of the key moments, the introduction of some of the most important characters, some of the most important early storylines, some of the most important visual designs, and then to write essays that accompany each one of the volumes to explain why these were indeed so important in their original context. So I would say they're classics of their kind, and we did our best to give them the kind of scholarly apparatus, if you like, the scholarly editorial introduction and suggestions for further reading, the kind of things that we associate with Penguin Classics as a label, and bring that then to this material that had never really been treated that way before.
I suppose they are a form of literature. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the comic industry, I just want to take you to some figures here. Marvel continues to dominate, with its market share rising from 36% to nearly 39% in the first quarter of 2024. DC Comics in the second place slipped from just over 23% to 21.6% in the same period. Now, together, these two comic book behemoths control over 60% of the global market for printed comics, and let's be clear, those that are sold in specialty stores. So going back to what are your thoughts on again, you've said that these comics are kind of the foundation of the modern day comic industry. What do these numbers say to you about where the comic book industry is heading? Is it likely to be continue to be dominated by the American comics that kind of have set the tone for these Hollywood movies and streaming wars and just this major pop culture trends?
Those statistics are interesting. I had not seen them before, and there are micro variations, of course, within different nations. Right now, when I go and talk to my local comic store, for example, DC's new Absolute line is apparently outselling any of their Marvel books by quite a bit. So you're going to get all kinds of microclimates, if you like. But I think one of the most interesting things about the statistics that you just showed is that almost 20% of the total sales was designated as other. And that suggests to me a really healthy, independent market. And also, I think getting those statistics and really learning from, knowing what they mean is complicated by the difference between monthly floppy comic book sales, digital sales, which I don't think any of the companies actually tell us, and then book sales, which bookstore sales. When I was younger, when I was in my teens and 20s, you didn't find any comics in traditional bookshops. And then there was a period where a handful of them might appear sort of tucked away in their own little section near the science fiction novels or something. You might find, in the 80s, a copy of Alan Moore's and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen or something like that. But in the last 10 years, that has completely changed. They're obviously one of the things that keep traditional bookshops open, especially the big box stores, the Barnes and Noble type stores. Now, if you walk into those places, you'll find new graphic novels, independently published or published by mainstream book publishers, Abrams and Routledge and Penguin Random House, and those things are put by the door, by the cash register, by the till, pride of place for new graphic novels that are not necessarily Marvel or DC material in the front of the bookstore. So I think it really, I think we talk about very different kinds of markets. And I think when you're talking about money and profits, the print industry is always going to be the impoverished, poor relation compared to the kinds of money that these corporate properties are making as merchandise and movies. So, so if you're talking only about the comics industry, then I would suggest that the future is not owned by Marvel or DC exclusively at all, that it's already actually a really diverse place, and an interestingly diverse place. But in terms of billion-dollar sales, it's going to be very hard to compete with intellectual properties like Batman or Spider-Man. But the comics publishing wing is just it's chump change even for those companies. They don't make much money out of publishing Spider-Man comics or Batman comics. It seems like a lot of money to publishers in other industries. I'm sure it would seem like quite a lot of money to you or me, but compared to the money that the merchandising makes in a single year, or compared to the money that one of those movies can make worldwide in a single year.
If I might just jump in here, then what is the scene for, and perhaps your students that do take your course and say, I want to be a creator, I want to make my own comic and self-publish. Like, what is the scene for them? Is there room for them to thrive, especially in a place where it is difficult to make money from these things unless you're associated with a big corporation with the support and backing to give you the necessary finances to be creative?
That's a really excellent question. And as a teacher, I feel a certain measure of responsibility in terms of what I'm trying to encourage young people to do with their lives, to the extent that they listen to me at all. I think it's very important that people have their eyes wide open about how difficult it is to make money in any creative medium. I think that there are remarkable cases of individual success where, I might think of Robert Kirkman and his collaborators. He was the creator of properties such as The Walking Dead and Invincible, or the guys that created the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles back in the 80s. But those are really sort of lightning in a bottle kinds of moments. I think at the same time, I wouldn't discourage somebody from wanting to write poetry or to paint or to write novels or to have a go at writing a film script. I would just want to make sure that they understood that they are probably not going to make a living out of it at first. If you really want to do these things, people who write poetry do it because they feel called to do it. People who produce comics, generally speaking, in my experience, the people who do it and keep doing it and do it well, they do it because they are called to do it, because it's a form of story making that they are just, for better or worse, drawn to. I mean, it's probably easier with the kind of technology that you have on the average cell phone nowadays to make a stop motion film or to make a documentary movie than it is to make a long form comic. It's probably one of the most labor intensive ways of trying to tell a story that exists. But it is also different from all of those other forms of storytelling. It combines the power and the spectacle of the movies with the intimacy and the quietness of private reading.
Right.
And I think it can be very powerful, very moving, and that's why people do it. They don't. I wouldn't tell anyone to go into it to make money.
So you've somewhat answered, I guess, my next question. Right now you've got tech platforms, streaming services investing heavily into animated content, stuff you see on a digital page. Are comics at the risk of being left behind?
No, I don't think so, because comics are actually really good at incorporating almost every other form of visual storytelling into themselves and then doing their own thing with it. And what they do is also unique. They combine the visual and the verbal in a mutually illuminating, there are always two levels of code, if you like, in any comics page. There is a relationship between the verbal and the visual, which is absolutely unique to the medium. And I don't see anything else replacing that. I think that accessing, certainly animation is not the same thing. Comics are not storyboards for movies that haven't been made yet. They handle motion and the whole storytelling experience really differently. An experienced and talented comic book artist doesn't think of their page as a storyboard. They think of the whole page as a visual unit. And so in many ways, the language of poetry has been more helpful to me in trying to understand how comics work on the page than the language of film. The two forms of language are at least equally useful in terms of trying to understand the medium. So I think, no, given the unique formal properties of the medium, the unique visual and verbal interactions that constitute the medium, I don't see it ever being replaced. I think it is, people may consume more comics digitally. That's certainly the case. But I find that people, students who fall in love with comics when they take the classes in our minor, often they read a lot of things digitally, but for the comics that they learn to really love, they want to own the physical object. They want to they want that experience. They might read. I read a lot of comics digitally. I have an iPad, and I read actually most of my Marvel and DC content. When I read it on the iPad. But there are forms of graphic novel that it's not satisfying to read them that way. The double page spreads, the relationship between the sort of the material instantiation of the object and the experience that you have reading it, that no digital experience can reproduce. So people might become more selective about the comics that they want to own. But it's like the book. It turns out that the codex, if you like, the form of a traditional paperback book, that's a really good information retrieval system. It operates to the touch of a finger. It stores a massive amount of information. You can write directly upon it and interact with it. It has not been replaced. And I don't see the paperback book actually ever being replaced. I think that it's just one amongst an ever sort of expanding variety of forms of media. So no, I think comics are pretty healthy from that point of view.
Yeah, I have to say I'm still a fan of the paperback book and having something to hold in my hands. So with your insight into pop culture and the comics history, what are the emerging trends that you can see? You mentioned digital comics and how that's still part of the a choice that people will have as opposed to taking over from the handheld comics. But what do you think will drive the next growth of the industry, drive the next kind of boom of comics? We're seeing in this part of the world somewhat of a revival, actually, in what was seen as a traditional art now coming back in a very different form. Can you see that happening, like becoming more of on a global scale, the way kind of DC, Marvel, and all of that managed to kind of become the gold standard?
Yes. I think that this is going to sound really self-interested, and I don't mean it that way at all. It's just an honest assessment, an honest attempt to answer this question. But for many years, particularly in this country, back in the 1950s and 60s, comics were seen as something that might actually harm a person's educational prospects, that somehow they would become over-dependent upon pictures and wouldn't learn to read properly, or that they would become, juvenile delinquents. What has become really clear, and librarians saw this, I think, even before most teachers did. It's the opposite is the case. Comics are a gateway drug to literacy. They are, when you can't get people to read, you can often get them to read comics. And actually, my own life story, is influenced. I'm a professor of literature. My first book is on 17th century English poetry. It's on John Donne. I've published on Shakespeare, and I don't just teach comics. I've spent this term teaching a Shakespeare course to 50 students. My career as a person who works with the written word happened because of my encounter with comics when I was a child. That was where I learned to fall in love with reading, and that's where I fell into the page. And I think that what will drive one of the drivers of the industry over the next decade or so will be the recognition on the part of libraries and educators that this medium is absolutely not a threat to literacy, but just the very opposite, that it is this gateway to literacy. And I think that more comics will be taught in schools. And as a result, more books will be purchased and more texts will be purchased for educational reasons. I mean, Shakespeare, the reason that Shakespeare still sells by the truckload is because people are required to read it in schools. So yes, I think we'll just see. I think the acceptance of comics and graphic novels as important educational tools is one of the things that will really drive the future of the medium.
Well, my younger self would have definitely been much more engaged academically if things were laid out in comic form, where there was a visual element to it rather than just lots of words in a page. I have to say, I love that sign behind you. It's so interesting, but please do not feed the fears. And on that note, you've said that you wish you could tell your 13-year-old self that, quote, all this geeky stuff matters. What would you tell 13-year-olds now with regards to dreaming about being part of the comic book industry, or maybe perhaps embracing comics more?
I would tell them that anything that takes you out of yourself in a positive and pleasurable way is to be encouraged. I think that one of the most difficult things about talking to any younger person right now is that the world is quite a scary place if they are paying attention. And we are all being fed through, the gods that we hold in our hands, these endless streams of negative information over the course of a single day, whether it's news of war or whether it is news about threats to the democratic process or whether it is news about new diseases and illnesses and the fear of another pandemic, or whether it is news about the climate and climate-driven forms of migration and the various crises that is creating, or whether it is fears about AI and whether there are going to be any jobs at all for most people. This is not an easy time to be young. And I think that I would say if you can put the phone down and read anything else, even if it is a graphic novel about genuinely painful and tragic things, and you're still absorbing, in some ways, a narrative about human beings at their worst, you're still, I think, having an interactive experience over which you have more control and which will be better for you in the longer run than the constant barrage of injunctions to consume on the one hand and reasons to be fearful on the other. I just think Ursula Le Guin said that, science fiction is often attacked for being escapist. And she would ask, what is wrong with that? If you're in a prison, shouldn't you be being encouraged to escape? If people feel trapped, then escape is what they need. So I guess I would say to any 13-year-old right now, if you can find something that isn't that experience of rapid information turnover social media, but is instead a slower experience. Even if it's a fantasy novel, if it's a graphic novel, if it's poetry, if it's music, if you are able to give yourself over to the traditional experiences of the arts using any media technology to access it. I don't care how you access it, as long as it's not in a form that is distracting you from the thing that you're trying to enjoy. Turn off your notifications when you're listening to music, or turn off your email when you're trying to read a comic. And just give yourself over to the experience of the arts. And I think it will help you to be healthy and sane. I really believe that. I think the worst thing that one of the worst things that we could be doing right now is cutting funding to arts and music and literature programs, because we have never needed them more desperately than we do now.
And beautifully said. Thank you so much. On that note, we'll have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thank you, Ben Saunders, Professor and Director of Comics and Cartoon Studies minor at the University of Oregon, for joining us from Eugene.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
So what do you prefer, Taiwan's manhwa or Japan's manga? Tell us in the comments below, and click the video next to me to watch our feature on the evolution of Taiwan's comic scene and why it's bigger than ever. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more stories on tech and business from Taiwan.